Now, just as a schedule issue, as I was looking at the calendar, we had an extra class that we were adding, but the problem is, on October 8th is Yom Kippur, on the 15th is Sukkot, and then the 22nd Paul Wilbur is here, and so to try to do 2 weeks and then a 3-week break and have people come back for the final class, it just isn't going to work. So what we're going to do is today and next week, and then we'll be done. So we're not going to do the extra class this session, this time. So
repeat that.
Well, today and next week will be the final classes.
Oh, okay.
So there was an additional class we were going to do that's not on stuff that's not covered in the book at all. But we decided we'll just do that. We'll do that another time. So, all right, today we're in chapter 7, which is called "To Live as a Jew." And interesting, in light of the things I was sharing in the message today, and in light of the season that we're in as well. Because really, Jewishness, especially in America, has really, in many ways, it's kind of come to be known as more of a cultural thing. And the reality is, living as a Jew, while there are cultural distinctives, it's not primarily a cultural issue. But a key is seeing the biblical nature of the call of the Jewish people. Jewish life, and really as we observe the different feasts and holy days, the idea is, as we are observing the feasts and holy days, we are reenacting these different aspects of the grace of God and His works through the history of the Jewish people, through the history of Israel. God called the Jewish people to be a sign people, a sign to the rest of the world who would demonstrate His faithfulness. And so the feasts and holy days all become kind of reenactments. Come on in. Reenactments in gratitude for all the ways that God has worked among the people of Israel. So, when Jewish people come to faith in Yeshua, obviously, one of the things that we stand for very strongly is that Yeshua does not require a doing away with the Jewish dimensions of life. Yeshua has to be central, but he does not. Belief in Yeshua, contrary to many, many hundreds and hundreds of years of history, belief in Yeshua doesn't mean that one stops being Jewish. And so we exist, of course, among other things, as a testimony of that. Yeshua was a Jew. Yeshua lived and walked as a Jew. Now, as believers, as Jewish and non-Jewish believers together, we've got to understand, and this is something that in some parts of the Messianic movement there can be a little bit of a turning of things in a way that's not always healthy. But Yeshua is our primary identity. Jewishness is not our primary identity. And that's what I'm saying is sometimes can get kind of reversed, and where the Jewish issue becomes the primary issue in the congregation, and Yeshua sort of takes a back seat and is secondary. And then that's not our conviction here. Our conviction is Yeshua is primary. Our life revolves around Him. The Jewish aspect of who we are is the secondary aspect of our identity, and so we just need to have that in perspective. Now, again, let me just say, as I'm sure you've seen and observed, the 4 different ones who've taught the membership class, probably all 4 of us have different styles completely. And I was talking to Kenny Dyer the other day, and he would say, yeah, well, we were primarily questions and just everybody sharing, and I'm open to that, but I sort of tend to just teach until somebody interrupts me. But, so I say that to say this, if questions come up, just don't hesitate to put up your hand, because I forget to make room for questions. And that's really what this is more important for, because the book is really for the teaching. And I'm kind of going over some of the main things in the book, but what's really more important is more important than my repeating things that Dan teaches in the book is if questions come up that we have opportunity to ask them. So maybe before I go even any further, any questions, not on this week's material, but any past weeks, anything from past weeks that we've had, any questions that you might have? Robin's leafing through the book there to see. Okay. Yeah, and if it comes up, that's fine. Okay.
I don't know, I don't recall reading it up to this point that we talked about circumcision and things like that. Does the book get into that?
About whether it's appropriate for say a believer who's not Jewish specifically, or just in general? I mean, I think it's probably touched on, but not necessarily. What kind of question specifically?
I don't know. Is it right to do? Is it right not to do? Is it
okay.
Does it matter?
Okay. Circumcision is something that God gave specifically. Now, there's several approaches, first of all, to looking at it. There's a basic health approach, which I guess there's debate on this issue about whether it is healthy or not healthy for a child to be circumcised on the 8th day. But I have to think that in light of the fact that God gave this, I have to think it's healthy. I have to think it's good for you. So and I'm sure you've all heard about San Francisco, I guess, trying to pass or considering passing a law barring circumcision. I don't know, maybe you've not heard about that. But, it's out of I don't even want to go there. Never. So, anyway, but in terms of the issue of where it fits in biblically, God gave Abraham the sign of circumcision as the sign of the covenant with Israel and with the Jewish people. Now, so I would say it is clearly right and appropriate for any Jewish person as a part of the irrevocable calling that Jewish people have with God, that Jewish people should be circumcised. Now the question may come up, well, what about people who are not Jewish? Should they be circumcised? And Paul deals with the issue more from the perspective of if you're doing it if you are doing it out of a sense of this is necessary to be in a better place with God, you're missing the point, and the answer would be no. And then the statement he makes is stay in the condition you were born. If you were born, or not born, but stay in the condition that you were when you came to faith. If you were circumcised, meaning if you were Jewish, you continue to live as a Jew. If you are not circumcised, you don't have to get circumcised. Now, that being said, there are people that.
Galatians specifically with that?
Excuse me?
You're talking about Galatians.
In Galatians, right. Because the issue, we have to understand, and I think this is a little bit misunderstood in Paul's teaching here and writing, because what sometimes people think sometimes that Paul is talking specifically only about the issue of circumcision. But circumcision was understood by Paul and the people of his day as, in other words, if you get circumcised, it's not just the act of circumcision you're doing. You are making a commitment to bring your entire life under all 613 commandments. In other words, to be circumcised was an intent to live under the fullness of the 613 commandments of the Torah. So, it's not when he says don't be circumcised. When he says don't be circumcised, he's saying basically you don't bring your lives under a legal approach to relationship with God. That's really the concept there. That being said, there are people who feel that God has convicted them, maybe not born Jewish, but that God has convicted them to undergo circumcision as a part of identification with Israel and the Jewish people, or just something God tells them to do. If that's something God convicts someone to do, I would say, go ahead and do it. So that's kind of a overly simplistic looking at that question. So, okay. Now, we want to look at the issue of the biblical covenants, because that's really the basis for understanding Judaism and living as a Jew. And there are several covenants in the Scripture. The first covenant is what's called the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant with Noah is found in Genesis chapter 9, and the promise that God gives there is that never again would he destroy the earth by means of a flood, and that is kind of a basic covenant that's made. But then probably the first covenant of significance to us as believers, Jew and Gentile, would be the Abrahamic covenant. The beginnings, kind of a description of the covenant, is found in Genesis chapter 12. The actual making of the covenant is found in Genesis, I think it's either 15 or 17. But the idea here is that God made a covenant with Abraham. It's a covenant that included the land of Israel. It's a covenant that in which God promised that there would be a nation who would come from Abraham's seed, from his descendants. And it's a covenant in which blessing would come to the world, and it's understood in retrospect that the blessing that would come to the world through Abraham would be through the Messiah, and through this, and I would say through the Scriptures as well. Circumcision is the outward sign of the covenant, and so those are kind of the basics of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, after the Abrahamic covenant comes what's called the Mosaic covenant, or I prefer to call it the Mosaic Constitution, because the Mosaic I do not see as a universal covenant. I see the Mosaic law as, and it's actually referred to a number of times in the Scriptures as the law of the covenant. In other words, God's covenant with Israel was the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic system was a system that God gave to Israel that was the law of the covenant that he made with them. In other words, the Mosaic system was the practical expression of a people walking in this, of a nation walking in this covenant relationship with God. And of course, the Mosaic Constitution, Exodus through Deuteronomy, is where that is found in various places. It's founded on God's acts of grace in the Passover. This Constitution was really key to transforming Israel from a group of tribes into a true nation. Because this became literally a constitution. I don't recall if Dan gets into this specifically, but the book of Deuteronomy, for example, is written very similarly to the way a constitution might have been formulated in ancient times. So this constitution, this law, included universal moral standards, which are of course summarized in the Ten Commandments. I think we could say universal social standards. Many, many laws related to loving one another, treating others as we would want ourselves treated. These are social standards that are universal standards. They weren't just for that day or that time. Also a part of the covenant, or the part of the law, was it included national celebrations, such as what we're doing here with Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and what we do throughout the year. Also in the Mosaic system, there were provisions for the temple worship that involves sacrifice, that involves the priesthood, all of which pointed to Yeshua ultimately as the one who would fulfill that sacrificial system. So that, again, we're giving a very, very simplistic summary of the Mosaic system. And then the fourth covenant is the Davidic covenant. God's covenant with David. This is found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And this is where God makes it clear that David would have there would be an everlasting line of descendants from David, from whom ultimately the Messiah would be birthed. Now, the ultimate covenant, of course, is the promise of the new covenant. Even in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy speaks of a heart circumcision. Interesting that that Rich was talking about that, and that's the parsha in the parsha for this Shabbat about the circumcision of the heart. This was in anticipation of the fact that God knew Israel was going to disobey. God knew Israel would not be ultimately an obedient nation. There was continual failure over generations, and that provided the basis for the prophets speaking of more to come, a better covenant. So you've got promises in the prophets like Joel chapter 2, talking about the fact that he said, in that day I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. This is clearly a new covenant promise. It was not fulfilled prior to Yeshua. It's not totally fulfilled today, but it's been largely fulfilled. You've got Jeremiah. Let's turn over to Jeremiah 31, because this is a very crucial statement. Jeremiah 31. Verse 31. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No more shall every man teach his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says the Lord, for I will forgive their sin and their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. So this is a new covenant with Israel and Judah. The new covenant is not made with the world. It's made with Israel and Judah, which means that the nations come into Israel and Judah's covenant as full members, as full equals, but it's coming into this covenant that God made with Israel and Judah.
So it's truly like being drafted into Judah or Israel.
Yes, definitely.
Why the distinction Judah and Israel?
Because at that time the two nations were divided, and they were divided into the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which was Judah, and then Israel was the other 10 tribes.
So
Three?
Israel or Benjamin and Judah?
No, Benjamin and Judah made up Judah, and the other 10 tribes made up what was called Israel. So, and that's why when people speak of the 10 lost tribes, it's speaking of Israel, which it's actually a little bit of a deception, because all of the 12 tribes were represented when they came back from the exile. It's just that many of them did stay in the nation. So they weren't actually lost. But
what happened to Dan?
That's a good question. Somebody just pointed that out, and I'd never noticed it, that Dan is not listed. I think is it in Revelation?
Yes.
Manasseh takes his place. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question, though. Somebody just asked me that this week.
I've wondered that for years.
Okay.
I've studied and wondered, what happened to Dan.
That's something I'll try to remember to look into that a little bit as to why Dan is not mentioned in Revelation. But
It might have something to do with the prophecy of the father.
Okay, could be.
He said Dan was like a serpent that would bite the heels of the rider.
Okay,
I don't know.
it's possible. That's possible. Okay.
You said many of the tribes stayed back in the nation.
Well, all right. When Israel went into captivity in exile in Assyria, and then later Judah went into Babylon. Eventually, under Ezra and Nehemiah, people from all 12 tribes came back, but many stayed in the nations. Many stayed in the nations where they were scattered. But see, if you recall, back in Jeremiah, before they were sent into, God sends them into exile, God tells them through Jeremiah, buy land here and prepare to come back, because you will be coming back. So, but obviously a lot of them didn't. And so the idea of the 10 lost tribes comes from the fact that many of those tribes stayed in, or many of the people stayed in the nations. But we see both in Ezra and Nehemiah, and we see it in the New Covenant, that there were, all 12 tribes were represented by the times of Yeshua, and certainly all 12 tribes returned, or representatives from all 12 tribes returned from the exile. Okay? Yes. Uh-huh.
They, I did a reading recently, sometime in the last year, where they were talking about the people in Afghanistan
Mm-hmm.
who speak Pashtun are one of the lost tribes. And they speak Hebrew.
Okay.
They speak Hebrew and have Hebrew customs.
Okay. That's not surprising.
In Afghanistan.
That's been found in many, many nations, including China. I mean, practicing observant Jews that have not been necessarily tainted, I would say, by modern rabbinic Judaism today. But yeah,
Parts of India also.
I think where I would differ with the terminology is I wouldn't call them lost tribes. I would say these were Jews who stayed in the nations where they were. Yeah, that's, I think, just about every nation. I mean, when God said He was going to scatter us, I mean, He really did it. He was very effective in doing it. Every nation probably in the world.
So you were saying that the new covenant was with Israel and Judah.
Yes.
So would we then, having a faith in Messiah, are we then the first fruits of that covenant? And
For sure.
It's not obviously completed. It's not fulfilled. So
Yes.
we're in that stage.
All right. I would say the first fruits of the covenant would have been the first believers in that we find in Acts, but then as the Gentiles came in, that was a joining into, and as Paul, now you have to be careful with the terminology here. It's not that the nations become Israel. The terminology Paul uses is that the nations become part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And the understanding with Commonwealth, he may get into that in the book. I can't remember if he does. It's been quite a few years since I've read the book. But the understanding, if you remember, probably the best modern example we have would have been the British Commonwealth. I mean, England had all of these nations that were part of the Commonwealth of England. They were not England, but they were part of the Commonwealth of England, and therefore, while they were not England, they shared all the benefits of England and had many of the advantages that the British nation itself had. And so it's an equal sharing of inheritance, but it still maintains there is a distinction of Jew and Gentile, not a better calling, but a distinctiveness of calling. Okay? We'll get into this actually more fully next week, that particular issue, because it's a very important issue where there has been a lot of confusion and I would say just bad teaching that's emerged and off doctrines that have emerged in recent years. So,
Repeat that about the Commonwealth being a shared.
well, it's a sharing as part of the Commonwealth of Israel. The nations come in to share the blessing of the new covenant fully. as full members. It's not like, okay, there's Israel, the Jews are the first-class citizens, and the Gentiles the second class. No, 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 no. It's equal members, equal sharing in the blessing of the Messiah. So, but yet, because remember, it goes back to the end of Jeremiah 31, where God said that the Jewish people would always be a distinctive, identifiable people on the earth. This is why we believe that there is an importance in maintaining a distinctiveness of calling between Jewish and Gentile believer. Now, for those of you who are not Jewish, who have come into the congregation, you're choosing to identify with that Jewish expression. But much of the church out there is not choosing to do that at this point in time. Now, my opinion is, and the scriptures doesn't necessarily teach this, but my opinion is, as we get into the millennium, the nations actually will be embracing more and more of that Jewish calling and Torah expression fully. But I don't believe it's necessarily incumbent upon the nations to do that at this point in time. And so what it shows is we have one new man, according to Paul, Jew and Gentile, one new man in Messiah. They may look different in terms of what the expression looks like. The Jewish expression is distinctive, and the expression of the church in the nations is distinctive, but we're one new man under God, and in His eyes. We're equal in His eyes. It's not that one is better than the other, but there is a distinctiveness. Okay? But again, we're going to touch on some of this. We're going to look next week specifically at the issue, and this is one of those difficult issues, challenging issues that Dan gets into in the last chapter of, all right, how does Torah relate to the Gentiles? How are we to understand this? And we're going to look at some really important things next time. Because there's a lot of teaching out there today that gets into, well, the Gentile church needs to become Torah observant. We don't believe that here. You may believe it personally, and you're welcome to believe that personally, but that's not our position here at the congregation. And we'll look next week at why. Okay? So, the new covenant, Joel chapter 2, Jeremiah chapter 2. All right, it's a covenant with Israel and Judah. Jeremiah 31. It's a covenant with Israel and Judah. It clearly says here, it is not like the covenant that I made with your fathers. It is not like the Mosaic system. Doesn't mean that it doesn't allow for the Mosaic system. It just says it's not like that. And then the key aspect of this covenant is the Torah, the law of God, was to be written upon our hearts. Okay? It is not an abolishing of Torah, but we would say the new covenant provides an enablement to be able to walk in the ways of the Torah. Okay? Remember, the meaning of the word fulfill, when we say Yeshua fulfills the Torah, fulfill just means to bring out the fullest meaning of it. Fulfill doesn't mean, okay, Yeshua came and fulfilled the Torah, therefore He did away with it. That's the way many in the church world understand the idea of fulfill, and it's just a wrong understanding of the word itself. Fulfill means to fill full. It means to bring out the highest meaning of it. And so this is done by the empowerment of the Spirit. We would receive a new spirit. God's Spirit would dwell in us. He also talks about safety in the land. There would be forgiveness and cleansing. There would be a power of forgiveness in our lives, working in our lives previously not experienced in the new covenant. So, and by the way, I believe the new covenant is not the fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant. It's the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay? And I believe Paul makes that fairly clear in the book of Galatians, because he talks about where did the law come into the picture. The law came after the covenant was made with Abraham himself. Yeshua is the fulfillment not of the Mosaic system. He's the fulfillment of the basic foundational Abrahamic covenant. Okay? Questions?
So next week we're going to get into this, and then what do we do with the Mosaic? You're not calling it a Mosaic covenant, you're calling it a Mosaic...
I think you could call it either one, but I'm trying to get away from seeing Because I believe the Mosaic system was given specifically for Israel, whereas the Abrahamic covenant is a covenant meant to be fulfilled in the nations, ultimately through the new covenant. So,
Mosaic system and Mosaic covenant are the same thing?
I mean, you can call it the Mosaic covenant, but I'm making a point of calling it a Mosaic system or the Mosaic Constitution because it was something God specifically gave to Moses for Israel to, we would say, to as a part of giving Israel that unique expression among the nations. And so this is where, for example, the Sabbath comes into the picture. Well, people say, all right, well, the Sabbath is a universal principle because it's part of the Ten Commandments. Yes, but the Sabbath is never given as a command until Exodus 29, 30, 31, somewhere around there. I don't remember the exact place. It's not given as a command until then. It existed as a principle of blessing that anyone could enter into. But it's not given as a command until it was given to Moses. And there it's given to Moses saying, it's actually given as a command in Exodus 19 with the Ten Commandments. But it's explained in Exodus 31, I think it is, where he says, I'm giving you this as a sign of my covenant with the nation. So just as circumcision with the male was a sign of God's covenant with the individual, Sabbath was to be a corporate sign of the covenant with the nation. Okay? But we'll get into that a little bit more next week in terms of why it's not necessarily why it's not our view that, okay, we're just to go to the churches and say, okay, you've got to start keeping Sabbath. We'll get to that next week. All right. The next thing he gets into is who is a Jew? And what does it mean to be Jewish? Well, the question of who is a Jew, the traditional thinking in the Jewish world, and this is based on rabbinic determinations, the traditional thinking is if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish, or if you convert to Judaism and you undergo circumcision, you're Jewish. But that's not the Bible. That's not the Bible. The Bible clearly, first of all, shows the descendants, shows the line of descendants to be through the men. I mean, that's just the reality of what we see. So we don't, even while we understand that the traditional Jewish world would say, well, if your mother's not Jewish, then you're not Jewish. We feel if either parent is Jewish, or I mean even grandparent, that if somebody has Jewish ancestry, they're Jewish. And so that would be our view.
Does that even include Joseph and Mary? Like who was of the line of David? Were they both?
Both were.
Both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they can't be done.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Now, the bigger question really is what does it mean to be Jewish, as opposed to who is actually, that's the bigger question is what does it mean? The Jewish people were meant by God to have a unique witness, kind of to be a witness nation among the nations of the world. Unique through their practices, which are found in Torah. That's why the Mosaic system are the practices that make Israel unique and different. Okay? So unique in their practices to unify them in remembrance of the past. All of the feasts look back in some way to God's preservation of Israel as a people. And some of them look back in ways how God preserved from really clear intentions of killing the Jewish, of killing off the Jewish people. It's an amazing thing to consider that, and it's explained by the Jeremiah passage that I mentioned from Jeremiah 31, where it said that as long as there's a sun, moon, and stars, there will always be a physical Jewish people on the earth. It's an amazing thing to consider. The Jewish people were driven from their homeland in the 1st century CE. The Jewish people are the only people group in world history to be driven from their homeland, to be apart from their homeland for more than 2 generations, and still survive as a distinct people group. Every other people group in world history that has been separated from their homeland after 2 generations, they died out as a people. They just became absorbed into whatever nations they were in. The Jewish people are the only exception to that in world history. Why? Because God said, as long as there's a sun and moon and the stars, even though the nations themselves will try to destroy you, you will never be destroyed as a people.
And that kind of goes back to what you were saying about scattered in all the nations and
Yes.
they're there and still practicing.
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
So- and the Jew, yeah, it's an amazing testimony of God's faithfulness.
Yes, yes.
So Jewish people have preserved the biblical heritage over ages, and and really that has kind of given rise to a sort of a universal sense of brotherhood among Jewish people themselves throughout the world. But the key in all of this is biblical heritage, because again, being Jewish, being a Jew is not simply a physical thing, although that is a reality. Being a Jew really involves heritage. And this is found, of course, in the Jewish feasts and practices. And really what I shared today really said quite a bit about at least the ones that we're in right now. But these are meant to be annual seasonal celebrations which were to be key in Jewish identity and calling. And you have to understand, and I mean, I'm a good example of this because I grew up in a very secular family, and yet, but I mean, you know, we maintained a little bit of religion, but I mean, listen, we observed the holidays. These were the things we did, whether we liked it or not, because we were Jews. And, you know, all of these were to be Thanksgiving times. And of course, Leviticus 23 outlines all of these. They're all celebrations of Israel's national life under God in fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. Now, there are 3 major pilgrim feasts. And the pilgrim feasts were feasts where the men would go to Jerusalem as a part of their observance. They were Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So those are really kind of considered the 3 central feasts. Although all the feasts are important in their own way, these were considered the 3 primary feasts: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. But the key in Jewish life and Jewish practice is Shabbat, the Sabbath. The central point of Jewish life. It's a weekly time of rest, worship, renewal. And again, as I mentioned before, it is meant to be a sign of the covenant of God's rescue from slavery and resting on the 7th day. We have to remember, at the time that Israel came out from Egypt, there was no such thing as a weekend. You know, I mean, it's a given for us. Well, it's a weekend, you know, that's just an American institution. There was no weekend when Israel came out of Egypt. There was not even a day off. And so it was a revolutionary thing when God gave the Sabbath to Israel, because he was saying to them, listen, you're going to take 1 day in 7 and you're not going to work. You're not going to fire up your ovens. You're not going to do this. You're not going to do that. It's going to be a day set apart for me. And you're going to find, and this is going to be a testimony to the nations, they're working 7 days, you're working 6 days, you have as much provision as they do. And that was the testimony. That was the concept of the Sabbath. It was the sign of God's covenant with Israel as a unique nation. So,
why do you think
yeah.
the boy or the young guy who was picking up sticks and they stoned him, was it just to be an example because it was so new? Do you think? Similar to Ananias and Sapphira, is that their names?
Yeah.
In the covenant, you don't lie.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, well, as far as why they stoned him, it's because, I mean, God gave the command to stone anyone who broke the Sabbath.
And
So,
I mean, it seemed like such
You're right. I mean, it did. It seemed like a very minuscule thing. And yet God wanted to maintain the principle with the people because I think he knew the pull would be, we want to work. We want to do what's necessary. Well, if we get this much in 6 days, what would we get if we worked for 7 days? And God, I think, was intent on making sure this would be a faith people that would express this principle of rest. And if you figure to just add on a 7th day what we've already got on the 6th, you're throwing out the faith principle. So, I mean, it's kind of like, all right, why did God tell Israel to destroy the nations in the land when they went in? Because they had to get out the influence. They had to, it was the only way it would be possible to really establish this nation that would truly be a testimony to God. God knew the influence of the nations would be pervasive if they allowed them to stay. And these were all nations that had their own perverse ways of idol worship and that kind of thing as well. And so, I mean, it was kind of a judgment as well at the same time. Okay? So, yeah.
And in this country, it's very difficult to keep the Sabbath.
Sure.
Because of all the cultural practices of the nation.
Yes. Yes. And in Israel, what's very cool about Israel is when you go there, I mean, it really does, except for the tourist things, everything closes down on Shabbat. It's funny, I was the pastor the pastor of the church where I was in Mexico a couple of weeks ago. He was telling me about their first trip to Israel, and they didn't know what they were doing. They just made reservations and went, and they when they got to the airport, they didn't realize the problem with it, but they arrived on the Shabbat, or actually it was late Friday, and so they took what was called, from the airport, what was called a sharut, which is like a taxi, and you can get some of them to drive on Shabbat, but the guy gets a little bit outside of Jerusalem and he says, I've got to drop you off here. I mean, they're like dropped off on the highway outside of Jerusalem, and they're thinking, we have no idea what we're doing here. I mean, God intervened and really helped them to get where they were going to. But I mean, it was just everything shuts down for the most part on Shabbat, and so it's very easy to keep Shabbat in Israel if you choose to do that, and even the secular people do, for the most part, keep Shabbat in the basic way. Anyway, it's seen as a break from the routine of work. It's a testimony of God as being the Lord of creation. We don't have to be subject to the tyranny of worry that would cause us to work 7 days. And it was really a step of faith for Israel to observe the Shabbat. And of course, as well, the Shabbat is mentioned as being a memorial of the Exodus itself. Okay? The prophets continually stressed this as a day to Israel as a very important day for Israel to be keeping. Lack of observance was a key issue of disobedience, and why? Because it struck at the heart of the issue of faith. For Israel to say we don't want to keep the Shabbat was almost as if to say we don't want this life under this God who's preserved us and kept us and promised to be faithful to us. It's like, so we want to do our own thing. That's why the Shabbat was considered so important for Israel. So, now the New Covenant, Yeshua points out the hypocrisy of seeing the Shabbat as a legalistic requirement versus seeing Shabbat as a gift from God and as a joy to observe. And so in a Messianic Jewish context, we see, even as Yeshua said, He is the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the source of real Sabbath rest that we experience. And Shabbat should be approached in a spirit of joy and a spirit of grace. It's very, very important. Just real quickly to go through some of the other feasts. Passover, of course, marks the exodus from slavery in Egypt. has many, many key meanings. There's the issue of the Passover lamb, the blood on the doorpost providing really that foundational image that Dan writes about for understanding our salvation, for the death of Yeshua. Paul uses this as key in explaining Yeshua's sacrifice. You have the issue of the unleavened bread. The Messiah's Supper is kind of a miniature Passover Seder. It's the Messiah's Supper or communion came forth in the context of a Passover Seder. So that's the first feast. Then it comes first fruits, which comes on the Saturday the day after the Sabbath. That's in the midst of the week of Passover. So the first fruits involved in offering to God for the first produce of the year. It's not a major feast. However, it is with the New Covenant meaning, that is the feast when Yeshua was resurrected, and so it's a very important thing that we celebrate. Then is Shavuot, or Pentecost. This comes 49 days after first fruits. It's a Thanksgiving feast for the wheat harvest. Later on, it was also came to be seen as the time of the giving of the Torah. And then on the New Covenant fulfillment, we see that as when God poured out the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 2. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. I've spent the last couple of weeks talking about that, so I'm not going to review that. But these are great times as well. Very important feasts. Although Yom Kippur is not exactly a feast until we get to the break fast. But they're important times to observe. The minor feasts would be, or celebrations, Simchat Torah, which will be at the end of Sukkot. Purim, which we'll get to, and usually it's late February, sometimes early March. Yom HaShoah, not a feast day, but it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's a very important day in terms of, again, uniting Jewish people and people who support Israel. Israeli Independence Day. Hanukkah. Hanukkah is considered a minor feast only because it's not listed in the Bible, but it was certainly an important event. And then Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, which comes in early August, where there's an observance of that. That was a day on the Jewish calendar when the temple was destroyed and other catastrophic events in Israel's history. Messianic congregations are intended to be, I think, a unique corporate witness of the Messiahship of Yeshua to the Jewish community, as well as to the church, I think also. It's a visible testimony to the Jewish people that Messianic Jews believe in Yeshua and yet have not forsaken our Jewishness. And we also testify, I believe, by the presence of those not Jewish. We testify of the oneness of Jew and Gentile in the Messiah, that He's made us one new man, and that is one of the great aspects of a Messianic congregation: is Jew and Gentile one in the Messiah, worshiping in a Jewish expression. It also provides a context for bringing up children in a Jewish lifestyle, which is very important for children maintaining a heritage over the generations to come. It's a great opportunity to enable Jewish people in general to see worship in a New Covenant context in a way that doesn't threaten them. In other words, Jewish people can walk into, if they're willing to get beyond the issue of, okay, we believe in Jesus, and they're willing to come into a Messianic congregation, it becomes, because there are things that they're familiar with, the Shema, the Torah, some of the liturgy that we do, it becomes a context where Jewish people can see worship that exalts Yeshua, but in a way that they can be at least somewhat comfortable with. But the issue of Yeshua does tend to make Jewish people in general pretty uncomfortable until they come to the point of embracing Him, obviously. So that's kind of a summary of the chapter. So I wanted to, again, open up to questions or comments and observations.
Right.
Yeah.
Under the part where it talks about other common the tallit with
Yes.
the fringes.
Yes.
But it also talks about the tefillin and the phylacteries. And
Yes.
I know that's something that's very big in Orthodox. And
Right.
I know in some Messianic congregations, they do it. And
Yes.
some they don't. Is that like an optional thing
Yes.
also?
Totally optional. I did not grow up, I grew up in a Reform home. I did not know what tefillin was until I was a believer, to tell you the truth, because we just, or Reform Jews don't. Tefillin, if you've ever seen the pictures of the Orthodox Jews with the black box kind of tied to their head or tied around their arm, their forearm, and their wrist. And they get that from, bind the Word of God as a sign, a sign around on your hand, as frontlets between your eyes. Well, is that what the passage means? Probably not. Is it okay as a symbolic thing to do? Yeah, it is. As long as...
The mezuzah on the door.
Exactly. I think the mezuzah on the doorpost is probably a little bit more realistically in line with what is described there than the tefillin.
Doorpost is mezuzah.
Right. That's actually the word mezuzah means doorpost. So, but the tefillin is something, I would, if anybody wants to do it, I wouldn't discourage them from doing it, but it was never a part of my upbringing, so I don't. I have a lot of friends who do.
What would the passage be implying that you do? I mean, it's not, it's literal.
It's bind as a sign upon your hand or your frontlets between your eyes. I mean, I think it's just continual focus. Always be putting it before you in every context of life.
Whether you're working with your hands or whether you're seeing things through your eyes differently than the world would see them.
Sure. Yeah.
But you're focusing on the Lord and the commandments.
Yes.
So then other things that you talked about, them being reminders, it's usually, even just the feast, how they're supposed to remind us, it's like it's an action that reminds us that
Exactly.
the things that God's done.
That's right.
The deep sea would remind people whichever direction they were going, like how the physical was going there.
Right.
So you wouldn't need probably ones here, and here, or maybe,
But you have to understand, the whole mentality of Orthodox Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism is to overdo everything out of a fear that they may not be observing it properly. And so there's a principle called building a fence around the law. In other words, you come up with 10 laws that will make sure that you don't break the one key law that's here. So there's one law in here, but then they'll add 10 to that they consider law, but it's mainly to protect you supposedly from breaking the law that it's in here. Probably the primary example of that is the Sabbath, where you've got hundreds of rabbinic ordinances that are meant to assure that you don't break the Sabbath. Well, it gets you into a whole legalistic orientation that's just crazy, to be honest.
Right.
And
in our town, we have a synagogue, and all the Jewish people live within walking distance of
Right.
our synagogue because they were forbidden to drive.
yes.
Yeah, so they were all within walking
Yeah.
distance, and you'd see them walking to the temple.
But let me give you an example. Let's say you're in a high-rise building. In Israel, if you're in a high-rise building, the elevators don't run on Shabbat. Well, I think it's more work to walk up 10 flights of stairs than it is to press a... See, they're saying if you press a button,
Lighting a fire. So
it's like lighting a fire. So what happens on Shabbat, by the way? So in places where there's just one elevator, you got to take the stairs. But what they do, like if you're in a hotel, because they know that tourists don't want to do this necessarily. So usually there's one elevator in a hotel that's meant for the Orthodox or meant for any strict Sabbath observing Jews that is just automatically going one floor at a time, goes up one floor, up the next floor. You don't have to, you just walk in, you don't press a button, but it's just automatically going, and then it automatically comes down. I'm absolutely serious. But see, this is an example of building a fence around the law, where the laws don't break the Sabbath, don't light a fire. Well, you can't press a button. You can get in the elevator as long as you're not the one that presses the button.
The electricity moving you?
The electricity's still doing it. So, but this is the hypocrisy of it. And this is, where Yeshua came, and obviously they didn't have electricity then, but when Yeshua came and said, listen, man, the Sabbath is made for man. It's not man made for the Sabbath. And so, another example, by the way, to kind of get into something a little bit more common, for using toilet paper, you've got to tear off the sheets of toilet paper before the Sabbath starts. You cannot tear off toilet paper.
Turn the opening of the refrigerator, the light goes on.
Yeah.
You call your rabbi, and what do you do?
Yeah. If you want light in your house, you have to turn it on before the Sabbath. It's okay for the light to be on, but you can't turn it on once the Sabbath has come. So that's what Rabbinic Judaism is. It is just, there are 613 laws. There are volumes of rabbinic writings that interpret the laws and give you all the things you have to do to keep them properly. And honestly, it's insanity. It's crazy. So.
We need the Sabbath police.
Yeah, really.
Keep them going.
Really, that's about right. And a lot of people drive on. Actually, they've loosened up on the whole issue of driving on the Sabbath too, because they realize, especially in America, people are spread out. And even the Chabad synagogue down the road, there's cars in there on Shabbat, so obviously they drive. So,
Maybe on a certain distance, but they drive.
yeah.
Go down a few walls.
Yeah. Join out your wall. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay.
The one about the clean and unclean food.
Yes.
Is that strictly for Jews, or does it apply to Gentiles, or is it optional for them?
Okay.
And is it optional for anyone? I always, because
All right.
I've heard so much.
Good question. I'll tell you my view, and this is not universal in the Messianic movement, but many in the Messianic movement would take the view that I would take. My view is that the dietary laws are given as a symbolic aspect of showing the separation between clean and unclean. So, for Jewish people, I believe it's right to observe the dietary laws as an identification with what God gave to Israel and the Jewish people. I did not grow up observing the dietary laws. I was a believer for a couple of years before I was convicted by the Lord that He wanted me to keep the dietary laws. So all right. So they're a part of the Mosaic system and symbolic of the issue of clean versus unclean. However, as many studies have shown, there are also health issues involved with the dietary laws. And so many people did feel like, well, just for the sake of eating healthier, many people choose not to eat pork and shellfish. The issue with all of these things, these unclean foods, is that these are all animals or fish that feed on death. In other words, they will eat other flesh. And as people, we are not to eat we're not to eat things that feed on death. That's the symbolic issue. Now, people like to point to Acts 10, and I'm talking about, say, the Gentile Christian world, to say, well, you don't need to keep the dietary laws, because Acts 10, the sheet and God said to Peter, don't call anything unclean. But listen, it wasn't talking about food. Later on, where God was just using food to make a point to Peter. When Peter was asking God, what does this mean? God makes it clear to Peter, you are not to call any people unclean.
So God is using a language Peter understood.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. He was using imagery in a language that Peter understood. People sometimes point to Yeshua saying that all foods were now clean. Well, the Yeshua didn't say that. When it says, the verses leading up to it, and then it says, thus Yeshua was saying all foods are clean. The context there is Yeshua was talking about the laws of the Pharisees about eating with unwashed hands. And in other words, and then Yeshua goes on to say, it's not if the food you eat has touched unwashed hands. And he goes on to make the point of it's what comes out of a person that's really important, really of most importance. But the point is, he wasn't saying now unkosher foods are okay to eat. He was saying all foods are clean to eat, even if your hands are not washed according to the traditions of the Pharisees. That was the context of that. So, I believe, is it necessary for a believer to keep the dietary laws? I would say no. My encouragement to a Jewish believer is to keep the dietary laws. And to anyone else who says, is this a good thing to do? I'd say, sure, pray about it. And if God says to do it, do it. So, Randall?
Rabbi, you're talking about the scavengers.
Yeah.
Well, even now that we have toxins in the water and things like that, those scavengers, they're more like that with it. And they collect more microns.
I believe it.
In their body.
I believe it.
Now people who are eating more of the shellfish, things like that.
Yes.
They're getting a much larger amount of that chemicals.
Okay.
The fish that are more free flowing in the ocean, and the scavengers they get it all. And then people are coming scavenging it all up too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting sick. From it.
Yeah, I really used to enjoy crabs and lobster and all that, but I can't eat them now.
There wasn't much of a sacrifice.
Yeah.
It was for me, we used to eat lobsters.
Oh, well, you're from where you're from. I mean, they probably crawled onto your plate, so.
Especially where I lived in Situate, Massachusetts, I was only a mile from
Yeah.
the fishing boats that came in, and the lobstermen and all of that, and it would go, you could go right to the dock and buy everything fresh.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they practically crawled onto your plate. That was before I was even a believer.
Yes.
And before I found out I was Jewish, so it's
Yes.
like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
I couldn't in good faith do it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. These kinds of things are things of personal conviction. And, to me, it's not something to impose on anyone. So I don't think we are more or less pleasing to God because we observe or don't observe the dietary laws. But I think that... Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah.
When you start eating clean, Rabbi, I heard something that I've never heard before. And it was of a group that's here in Florida. They had killed a wild hog, and there was a certain way that you're supposed to skin them and got the thing, stuff like that. Somehow or another, they didn't skin that hog right, and the air, out of the hog came that air that made people sick,
Huh.
but who had nothing to do with the hog.
Gosh, wow.
And they went to corn.
Wow, I've never heard of that. That's pretty serious.
And it was all because the guy who mentioned it, he forgot word, because it wasn't cleaned properly.
Okay.
It was getting clean.
Huh.
And people who were in the area of it, whatever it did, they let off some fumes or something.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah. That's good.
Okay. Okay. All right. Anyone else? Other questions? All right. We will finish up next week. As I said, we'll be looking at some very important things, and we'll see you then.